Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Andrea Longton is an award-winning author and professional social justice investor. She has raised over $1 billion for social justice investments in the United States and has advised on another $1.5 billion worldwide. Andrea has a new book, and it is titled The Social Justice Investor: Advance Your Values While Building Wealth, and it will be released later this month on April 23rd. Her professional experience includes positions at Opportunity Finance Network, Freddie Mac, Capital Impact Partners, which is now Momentus Capital, and Delphos International. Andrea holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation, that's CFA, from the CFA Institute, and has worked in structured finance investments, capital markets, and change management. Hello, Andrea, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Andrea, you have held a number of positions in traditional investment industries, and now you've dedicated your work to driving capital to low-wealth communities around the country. What distinguishes social justice investing from more traditional forms of capital market investing?
Sure. Great question. To me, it all comes down to the social justice aspect of that investment. Whereas traditional investing is very focused on profit maximization per unit of risk, social justice investing focuses both on sustainable financial earnings as well as social justice returns. So when you think about traditional investing, a mainstay tool is called the Investment Policy Statement, or IPS, which I refer to in the book as an investor roadmap. And what that does is lay out what are my objectives for my investment, so those are your risk and return, as well as my constraints, which can be taxes, timing, legal considerations, liquidity, and unique circumstances. And when traditional investors try to create a social justice aspect or an ESG aspect or sustainability aspect, they often put those considerations in the bottom of the nice-to-have pile, which is unique circumstances. And social justice investing pools that social justice aspect, which I include climate justice in social justice investing, pulls that social justice, climate justice perspective from the bottom of the nice-to-have pile and puts it into the top of the return requirement. And that single change creates this butterfly effect that then filters through every part of an investment decision, from which investments do I consider purchasing, all the way through how am I managing the performance of this investment portfolio.
Now, Andrea, impact and sustainable investing continue to grow in popularity, especially with generations X, Y, and Z investors. How are these approaches to capital market investing different from social justice investing, if they are?
Yes, great question. There are two main differences. Social justice investing focuses on sustainable financial earnings rather than competitive financial returns, whereas sustainable investing focuses on competitive financial returns as well as these ESG returns. The second difference is that social justice investing demands evidence of real on-the-ground change. So to me, social justice investing is a sharper view into sustainable investing and impact investing, where social justice investing wants to see that evidence of how are we seeing real change on the ground? How is this changing someone's life or a group's life or society, how it works? And what is this division of resources, opportunity, and privileges? And I think a big difference too is that social justice investing isn't going in saying you're going to get the same returns as traditional investing. We're saying we want sustainable returns. So we're not looking for the highs and lows of what traditional investing often offers through Wall Street. We want what is the level that we need to meet our needs and our family's needs? What is enough That's the level that we're at. We're not trying to chase profits. We're trying to cover what we need, and we're also trying to see evidence of real on-the-ground change in society.
Andrea, you were involved in a number of companies during your career that were focused on a more traditional approach to investing and what strategies were about and what returns were expected. How were the concepts and details of social justice investing developed during your previous professional roles in financial services?
Yeah. I had a fairly unique experience in that I was earning my CFA charter, which is this classical and traditional investment training, and really Wall Street gold standard of how to make a good investment. So I was earning this education. It took 3 years because it's 3 tests that when I was taking it, you can only take once a year in June. So while I was studying and learning that traditional focus, I was sitting at different financial institutions that were focused on development finance. Some were more for profit and some were definitely nonprofit. And the difference between those two cultures, while I was learning these financial fundamentals, was really powerful to me, and how two very different cultures looked at those same financial fundamentals and came away with two very different sets of financial products, two very different ways of how they talk about investing, and two very different ways of how we approach communities, both on a global scale and in the US scale. And so, because of that fairly unique experience, I was able to look at what does finance really boil down to from an investor standpoint. What do I want to see going back to that investor roadmap? What is important to me and how do I get there? And at the same time, about halfway through earning that CFA charter, I took a position at Capital Impact Partners, which is a social justice investment firm. It's a community development financial institution. And I was able to sit in a culture that really taught me how to think about social justice investing when we're listening to the communities to tell us what they need in order to reduce the racial wealth gap, in order to look at gender equity, in order to look at how do we address LGBTQ plus discrimination, how do we look at climate change on an equitable standpoint. And that culture really taught me how to look at financing through a different lens. And I wrote this book to distill that knowledge and wisdom that I had learned from living among pioneers in the field into this how-to book, but also an inspirational book, because it's how the field was taught to me. It's how the industry was taught to me, was by listening to folks like Ellis Carr, Bill Bynum, Christina Travers, Rachel Roboshoti, Sonia Dreisler, Lakota Vogel, and how are these people approaching financing, whether it's in Indigenous communities, if it's in capital markets, if it's talking to financial planners about how are we thinking about this. And so the book ended up being a distillation of how I learned it, but written down. Because I'm a visual person and I need to see things written down in order to learn them, and I need to write them in order to learn them. And when I was looking around, there really wasn't this written knowledge of how does social justice investing work, both as a technical how-to, but also what are the stories coming into this, because stories are such an important part of how we see social justice investing work. And I think that has to do with the fact that when we're talking about social justice returns, they can't be measured in the same way that you measure financial returns. Financial returns are numbers. And so you can measure them like you're measuring lines on a ruler. But when you're talking about social justice returns, you need stories, you need anecdotes in addition to data to show you what is the full impact of what we're doing. And so I bring in these stories throughout the book of how are people thinking about social justice investing? What are examples of social justice investing? So we can see that even if you can't measure it on an Excel spreadsheet, and I love Excel spreadsheets very much, but they cannot compete in how do we measure on the ground impact.
Andrea, you've used the term development finance, and let's explore that language a little bit more.
Sure.
It's, in my experience, and a much larger concept than any particular form of portfolio investing.
Mm-hmm.
Tell our followers what you mean when you use that terminology, please.
Yeah. I think I'm jumping back and forth between professional and personal investing too, because at least from my standpoint, my professional background is in development finance and how,
Okay.
as professionals who were doing this for a living, we can use financing to drive resources, i.e., money, and technical assistance and know-how into a project. And so that development finance is driving financing towards a project that then develops an economy and builds an economy. And so it's finance for the purpose of building a more robust economy. And so we hear the phrase development finance more on an international basis whenever we're thinking about, and this is dated terminology, but when we're thinking about developing countries and development finance. And so we're thinking about how do we develop that economy. And so in my mind, when I started writing this book, that's great from a professional standpoint. But how do everyday people think about how they can use their money to finance the world in which they want to live? And so I guess how do they develop that economy? For me, when I think about social justice investing, I'm thinking about on a US basis. So in the US, but then what do those products look like? And how do you approach that? And what if you have absolutely no background in finance or investing? Then how do you, as an individual person who has a different area of expertise, use your money to pursue your dual goals of building enough wealth for your family to be able to meet your expected and unexpected cash needs, and also do it in a way that it builds the world you want to live in, that you want for your children or your nieces and nephews or your grandchildren to be able to live in. And a lot of people view that as a world in which we have a climate that is hospitable to children in the future, but also one that has resources that every person needs in order to reach their full potential. And that's what I try to distill from a professional experience in development finance of how do we develop an economy broad scale, but then pull it into and democratize it for everyday people to be able to say, okay, but here's my portfolio. How do I select products that are available in this impact investing universe and pull them into my portfolio so that I know that I'm building wealth for myself, but also I'm doing it through products that reflect my values and create the world through on-the-ground change that I want to see.
Okay. So one more question on development finance.
Yeah.
And that is, how is it different when people do it here in the U.S. versus how it's done, for example, in developing economies,
Mm-hmm.
the smaller economies, especially in the global South?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To me, the only difference is exchange rates
Okay.
and language. Where you don't have, exchange rates are complicated, and you have to constantly say, okay, if I made $1 investment, then what is that going to come back in a different currency? And that
Right.
gets complicated. And so if you're thinking about it in the US, I guess what really shocked me when I went from international development finance. So in the early 2010s, I was working on how do we bring telecom to the Middle East or enhance telecom in the Middle East, and also renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa. And how do we think about this? And, going to visit was really shocked that conditions on the ground were not dissimilar to conditions on the ground where my grandparents lived in Appalachian, Kentucky. And that many communities, the big difference is lacking resources and lacking financial resources needed in order to build a small business, in order to, in the US, to own a home, to have a infrastructure that's not crumbling in on itself, to have renewable energy resources. In many ways, the renewable energy that we're seeing now in climate change investments is building on lessons that we've learned in the global South or in other emerging markets. We're now being able to bring those lessons back to the US as we're getting increased financing to flow into renewable energy in our own backyards. And so a lot of it, the number one thing that I have seen in development finance, both abroad as well in the US, to be successful is to listen to the community. Because oftentimes, or always, the best insights for success are found by people who are sitting closest to the problems. and not by folks coming in saying, well, if you use your money like this, the spreadsheet, again, I love spreadsheets, but they're not the best way to get to know a community. And they're not the best way to take those insights from the community into the project. So for example, Addisino Social Capital, a group based out of San Francisco, California, created an investment initiative called Force the Issue. And it had to do with sexual harassment in the workplace. And how do we decrease sexual harassment in the workplace through our power as individual investors? And so they went and listened to people who sit closest to that problem and were in the sphere of gender equity investing and said, what do we need to fix? What's the problem? What's the solution? And they were really, Addisino was really surprised when women came back who were survivors of sexual harassment in the workplace or were women's advocates for gender equity in the workplace. They said, actually, it's forced arbitration and private arbitration. And I went, what do you mean? Well, when you work for a company, you have to sign disclosures and agreements and employment agreements. And part of it was that if there was ever something that happened that we needed to work out between employee and employer, it would go into private arbitration. It could not go into the courts. And so because of this, sexual harassment claims were dealt with through private arbitration. And because the private arbiter worked for the company or the employer, then research showed that the findings went more towards the employer than to the employee. And so this had unintended consequences of continuing practices of sexual harassment and victims who weren't able to go to the courts in order to talk through this. And then, so we continue to see this practice. Whenever Addisino Social Capital then went through and asked 3,500 publicly traded companies, do you have this practice of forced arbitration? They created an index of those who did and those who didn't, and enabled investors to then select their investment purchases through companies that did not have this practice. And as a result of this initiative, 300 companies changed their practices to no longer have forced arbitration. And this impacted 10 million employees. And so this listening to the impacted community in order to have the best solution for an investment is one that I've seen from telecom in Afghanistan, where listening to the community meant, oh, no, don't bring in private security, hire people from the local village or the local town to watch the telecom tower at night was a much more successful project. And it's the same even in capital markets in the US, whenever we're talking about how do we look at investments and how do we listen to the impacted communities and then work backward toward that, to a good investment solution.
Yeah, thank you very much for those examples. That's very focused and enlightening in terms of the kinds of issues that are really on people's minds when they think about social justice, period, whether it's investing or in just living in their day-to-day lives. And so from that perspective, what do you hope your readers will take away from your book?
I hope they'll take away the confidence to take the next step. Finance can be really intimidating, especially if it's not your area of expertise. Even if it is your area of expertise, it can often be really intimidating. But when you peel back the onion, you discover that it's not that hard. You can absolutely do this. You can take the first step to call your financial advisor and say, hey, I'd like to see more social justice investments in my portfolio, or ESG investments or impact investments in my portfolio. You can call your HR manager if you invest through a 401k. Say, hey, I'd like to see that my ESG options or my impact investment options or my social justice investment options in my menu of 401k investment options. Or you can set up a DIY investment portfolio through an online brokerage account through Ellevest or Fidelity.com or Schwab.com, just to name a few. So it's the confidence to take a next step, because research shows that lots of people are interested in sustainable investing. Morgan Stanley Institute of Sustainable Finance just came out with a research that showed that, pull up my notes here, that showed that 96% of millennials are interested in sustainable investing, but that 70% of baby boomers are interested in sustainable investing. And even more interesting was a demographic of political views, where 94% of those who identify as very liberal are interested in sustainable investing. But most interestingly is 77% of people who identify as conservative are interested in sustainable investing. So we're seeing this across the board as an interest. And here's the kicker for me, was that of those polled, and these are active individual investors, 52% of respondents said that their knowledge was limited about how to start investing sustainably.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that to me is
That's a
wild.
huge percentage, and we need to do a lot more about that, right?
That's
And
right.
that leads me to my final question today,
Yeah,
which is when and where will your book launch be held?
absolutely. We're going to hold a big book launch party in New York City at Lisk's headquarters on April 23rd. And then we're going on a national tour. So we'll be at Calvert Impact in the DC area on June 5th. And then we'll be in Oakland, California on June 18th. So if you are at all interested in any of those dates, please check my website at www.thesocialjusticeinvestor.com to RSVP. We're also doing a virtual book club with a bookstore partner, Tertulio, which is a really cool co-op bookstore, to host a virtual book club beginning May 9th. All of these are free. You're very welcome to join. And you can buy the book anywhere where books are sold.
Terrific. Well, Andrea, where else online can followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast either purchase your book or a copy of The Social Justice Investor? And how can they contact you directly with questions about the subjects that we've discussed in today's episode?
Absolutely. You can buy books wherever they're sold, whether that's Barnes & Noble, Amazon, your local bookseller, Tertulia Co-op bookstore, which actually offers us a 20% discount if you use the promo code JUSTICE with free shipping. And you can always contact me via my website at www.thesocialjusticeinvestor.com or on LinkedIn. My name is Andrea B. Longton.
Terrific. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us today on the Sustainable Finance Podcast. And for our followers, tune in again next week for the next episode. I'm Paul Ellis, your host, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.